Nan, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I hope I live up to it, and good morning to all of you. You know, it's my job to set the scene for our discussions today, and I'm going to do this by running you through the main themes in our meeting paper, working together in the field for effective humanitarian response. Now, I think it's a very timely moment to address this topic, as the Minister alluded to a moment ago. Humanitarian crises appear to be becoming more frequent and intense, with ever-increasing numbers of actors. And that makes working together even more important, and sometimes it may seem like an almost impossible quest. Yet it is happening, and the aim of this meeting is to get a deeper understanding of what works and why. But before I get on to this, I'd like to start with a bit of social anthropology. So I'd like to take us back to the 1930s when Evans Pritchard wrote his classic ethnography about the Nuer, a pastoralist people from southern Sudan. Now, I studied this book many years ago and became fascinated by the Nuer's social system, which Evans Pritchard described as an acephalous, segmentary system of affiliation characterized by fission and fusion. Now, in plain English, that means that the Nuer didn't have a leader. They were acephalous. And the biggest unit, the tribe, was made up of many different sections, clans, subclans, and lineages, all of whom were discrete entities in themselves. Now, the life of a Nuer pastoralist revolved around their cows, and their main aim was to ensure adequate access to water and pasture. But this was not easy because grazing was in short supply and Nuer land covered a vast area. And the solution to the problem relied on the clans and the subclans coming together to share pasture when it was relatively abundant. That's when the clans fused, and splitting up in leaner times, that's the fission of the clans, to take advantage of smaller waterholes and pasture. Now, this system was mobile, it was adaptable, it was flexible and dependable, and it optimized the use of scarce resources. Now, Evans Pritchard described it as organized anarchy, but it also can be seen as a classic example of collective action, which brings me to a question which I'd like to pose to all of you. Can you think of another system that's made up of a constellation of geographically dispersed groups, all with distinct identities but sharing common values and principles, a system without a leader but with the ability to combine its capacities and address a common challenge when circumstances dictate? Anyone think of anything that resembles anything like that? Yes, I think there's a few people nodding down here. It's a humanitarian system, of course. And of course, this is what our current humanitarian system looks like, as you can see on the slide now. So you can see that whilst the Nuer are concerned with water and pasture, we of course are concerned with saving lives, protecting vulnerable people, and rebuilding livelihoods. And much of the evidence that we have tells us that the best outcomes are often achieved when the system works collectively. So, for example, we can improve coverage by avoiding duplication and decreasing gaps in a response. Working together can improve effectiveness at key stages in the project cycle, including design and assessment. Working together, for example, in the humanitarian country teams, the clusters and coordination bodies, networks and so on, can create high levels of communication, which in turn can improve decision-making for effective response. It can also improve efficiencies in terms of finances and other resources. Working together can potentially bring costs down, reduce duplication, and achieve economies of scale. Now, a good example is the logistics cluster, which provides the coordinated provision of services. So when international agencies and national organisations work together, there can be great benefits. International agencies can provide new resources and increase scale, whilst local agencies can provide local knowledge and know-how. And this can result in better and more appropriate responses. Now, working in a more connected fashion with governments, with civil society and other actors can then help ensure a smoother transition between various phases of the disaster cycle and ensure that longer-term implications like displacement camps or resettlement fit with longer-term planning. And finally, all humanitarian aid needs a degree of coherence, of course, between the objectives and the different bodies of law, of rights and principles and policies. And working together can bring these pieces together. But it also represents real challenges where the principles of independence and neutrality clash with the orientation of governments. I think we might hear a little bit more about this later. So all of that sounds very desirable, but in reality, agencies have not found it easy to work together. Now, this has been well documented, and some of you may remember a paper by Conrad van Brabantbank in 1989, which outlined some of these difficulties, all of which remain relevant today. And they include the differences in organisational mandates, the tensions between the time required for coordination, the speed required to act quickly, resistance to creating yet more layers of unwanted bureaucracy, and the costs in terms of staff and time. And now, 16 years later, we have another constraint, which is the sheer number of people involved in humanitarian response. In most cases, working with everybody may not be feasible or indeed desirable. So what do we mean by coordination and working together? You know, these words and others like them, interoperability, working as one, and so on, are bandied around a great deal, but often with a lack of precision as to their meaning. And to help find some clarity here, we've developed something called a spectrum of humanitarian coordination, which differentiates between the level of coordination in terms of the amount of commitment, time, level of formality, and the amount of organisational autonomy which has been sacrificed as a result. And you can see from the slide there are 5 different levels of coordination, ranging at one end from complete autonomy of the spectrum, to total merger at the other. So if we start at the communication stage, we can see that organisations share information with one another with no specific requirement to take exchanged information into account during their work. Now here, there's almost no loss of autonomy, but it can become more formalised when common reporting procedures and shared indicators are used. Now at that point, communication starts to shift into new ways of working together. One of these ways is cooperative alignment, which usually involves organisations working independently but agreeing amongst themselves to fit in with the plans of other agencies. Now, this may include following common standards and guidelines to data collection through joint evaluations, planning, or evaluations. This still leaves organisations with a very high level of autonomy and freedom to work pretty much as they wish. Now, moving further to the right of the spectrum, collaborative activities are more formalised and involve organisations aligning their work plans, and whilst maintaining their own independence, they carry out activities together using a single plan. Now, they will tend to have agreed on the what, where and how of activities and will have gone into more detail on common approaches than agencies that are merely cooperating. Now, agreements here will tend to be formalised, and collaborating agencies may well share resources amongst themselves. And finally, at the far end of the spectrum, we have mergers where 2 or more organisations combine into one, just as HAP and People in Aid did recently, if my information is correct on that. So, moving on, of course, there are many different factors which influence an organisation's position on this spectrum, including context, phase in the project cycle, and power imbalances. Now, some contexts, of course, are more conducive to coordinated approaches than others, and I just want to highlight 3 of them. Natural disasters, for example, lend themselves to coordination more than complex emergencies, partly due to the tension between short-term life-saving activities and longer-term objectives associated with peace and state building. At the same time, however, some elements in complex emergencies tend to support more collaborative work, as we've seen in Mali, in Somalia, and in Syria, where many international agencies have had to work through remote management mechanisms, which often, of course, involve a high degree of often tricky collaborations with local organizations. Now, coordination and collaboration appear to be easier in some phases of the project cycle than in others. For example, in the assessment phase, we've seen many kinds of joint assessments, including those led by the IASC Assessment Task Force in Pakistan, and the Interagency Rapid Response Mechanism, which has been used in DRC and Central African Republic. And of course, coordinated approaches are less common in the design phase of the program cycle, but they do occur at a fairly high level through the clusters and the HCTs, who now produce a strategic response plan, of course. And finally, it's important to differentiate between coordination that's implemented by a command from a position of power and authority, or coordination that's put in place by consensus. There are different modalities based on where the power lies, so ranging from voluntary consortiums and communities of practice through to formalized structures like the clusters, and then right through to compulsory arrangements where participation in government structures or UN integrated missions conditions access to resources and affected areas. Now, of course, the parts of this spectrum are not exclusive categories, they're ideal types, and the reality, of course, is much more fluid. And in our research, we came across the concept of a messy partnership, which is based on the premise that stable identities don't exist at all. And when new organizations or coalitions emerge, the visions and policies of these organizations need to be integrated with each other, and this creates a kind of ongoing movement and an ever-changing organic structure. Now, this is an interesting point, but one that we don't have time to explore in detail at the moment. But for the purposes of this meeting, the basic message is that not all kinds of coordination are the same. They involve different levels of investment and offer different degrees of return and are dependent on context. And of course, we'll be running a group exercise this afternoon, asking all of you to cooperate in the way that's illustrated on this slide. So I'll be very interested to see how that works out. I'm joking, of course. So to recap briefly, we've looked at the benefits of working together. We've touched on some of the factors that make it difficult, and we've found a common understanding about some of the different ways that organizations work together in practice. Which now brings us to ask whether it is always desirable for agencies to move from left to right across the coordination spectrum towards greater degrees of cooperation. Now, this, of course, is an important question. There are a lot of arguments against too much coordination. So, firstly, too much coordination can lead to organizations losing their distinctive personalities and becoming homogenized. Now, whilst this can bring about efficiencies, it can also have a negative effect on open debate and innovation, and ultimately lead to a form of narrow, system-wide groupthink. And secondly, power disparities can create a situation where less powerful organizations may be forced to compromise on their aims and their principles. And this, of course, has been an issue for many NGOs where country coordination structures are related to UN integrated missions. Now, organizations can be legitimately concerned, I think, that they will not be able to work in a neutral and independent way, and that coordination will lead to less humanitarian access. And again, I suspect we may hear more about this later. Now, the same concern can arise, of course, when humanitarian organizations work closely with the state. And this tension is well known. It's not going to go away anytime soon, as illustrated by this quote from the United States President just a few weeks ago. I won't do the voice, but this is what the President said. He said, "It's one of the things I'd like to do over the next couple of years, to try to erase this very sharp line between our military efforts in national security and our diplomatic and foreign assistance efforts. Because in this environment today, we've got to think of it all in one piece." So, At the heart of this question is the idea of who are we? And I want to come back to this later. So we can see, in summary, that there are significant benefits for working together, that it can be challenging, but there are also coherent arguments against too much coordination or collaboration. So we'll move on now very quickly to look at the number of specific formal humanitarian frameworks and structures for working together, including coordination by government, laid out in the General Assembly Resolution 46182, and the IASC coordination system at country level, specifically the HCTs, the clusters, and the cluster coordination mechanism, the ICCM. And here there's an increasing amount of evaluative evidence being generated to demonstrate their effectiveness. Now, many international and NGOs are now part of consortiums, country networks, and different types of partnership and families, all of which provide a wide variety of opportunities for working together. And the involvement of non-traditional actors like the military and the private sector necessitate new ways and methods for cooperation. Now, all of these, of course, have their particular challenges and successes, and we'll be looking at them all separately and in more detail in the panels over the next couple of days. So we're also looking at a variety of factors that can support organisations working together through informal arrangements and relationships. And these include the use of funding mechanisms directed towards coordinated multi-actor approaches, including the SURF, the CHF, and the emergency response funds. And finally, technical and accountability standards and shared procedures, such as SPHERE and a core humanitarian standard, can lead to very different actors working in similar ways. And we'll be looking at these experiences in our panels and other events as well. So let me end now with a personal reflection on the NUA and their acephalous system of segmentary affiliation. Now, to me, it represents a kind of traditional microcosm of our own humanitarian system. And it's true that the NUA had their own internal issues and disputes. And as I said earlier, Evans Pritchard called it organised anarchy. Now, in today's business school parlance, we could call it a messy partnership. But the book describes an extraordinarily functional system which worked to achieve its central aim of optimising scarce resources. And if you ever read the book, like me, you may think that the central reason for its success is what Evans Pritchard called internal consistency. And by this, he meant that the NUA had a shared worldview. They were all descended from a common ancestor, and they absolutely shared the same values and the same principles. They did not think twice about acting as one. It was second nature to them. And I think this is a key point, and it provides us with our own existential question to reflect on. Do we all share the same values and priorities, and do we as a community always want to act as one? And if we do not have internal consistency like the NUA, how can we best work together? Now, this may be one of the questions we may want to address along with others outlined in the report. And I'll finish now with a few more. So, do we have a common understanding of what coordination and related terms means? What are the key elements to be considered when deciding if or how to coordinate? How can we work effectively with organisations which do not share our objectives or principles? And finally, for the evaluators, how can we measure and evaluate the effects of working together? So thanks very much for listening, and thank you to Paul and to Luz for this excellent report. Thank you very much.